He watched his father get murdered when he was just 8 years old. By the age of 15, he was tracking down the killers. By 20, most of them were dead. And today, he's a college mascot. You see, in the 1870s, Pistol Pete had not yet become a cartoon cowboy on the sidelines. Back in those days, he was a real-life teenager with a real gun and a very real grudge. The pint-sized pistolero not only avenged his father's death, but he also became the youngest deputy US Marshal in all of history. Maybe. Join me today as we attempt to separate fact from fiction, college football style. Who was Frank Eaton? How did teenage gunfighter become the face of Oklahoma State University? Where did he get the nickname Pistol Pete anyway? And how true are the stories of him tracking down his father's killers? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza.
Yeehaw!
Frank Boardman Eaton was born on October 26, 1860, in Hartford, Connecticut. His family would head west when he was still a boy and settle in Osage County, Kansas, some 30 or so miles south of Topeka. Now, at that particular time, Kansas was not exactly the safest place in the world to be putting down roots. The war between the states may have been over by the time they arrived, but the area was still most definitely infested with former guerrillas, rough sorts who had developed a taste for violence during the previous hostilities, only to then go ahead and rebrand themselves as so-called regulators. And unfortunately for the Eaton family, Frank's daddy Francis represented pretty much everything that these regulators despised. Not only was he a Yankee, but he was also an abolitionist to boot. I guess the idea that all men are created equal and should be able to enjoy the same types of freedom, regardless of the color of their skin, was just a bridge too far for the ex-bushwhackers. So that being the case, a total of 6 men, reportedly from the Campsey and Ferber families, rode up to the Eaton homestead one day, called out Frank's daddy, and shot him dead right there in front of everybody. Young Frank was just around 8 years old at the time, and as I'm sure you can imagine, watching his own father murdered before his very eyes had quite the impact. But then again, so did the words of one of his father's friends, an old boy by the name of Mose Beeman. Mr. Beeman approached Frank there at the funeral, put his hand on his head, and uttered a cryptic warning that would shape the rest of his life. May an old man's curse rest upon you if you do not try to avenge your father. In the weeks and months that followed, Beeman began instructing Frank on how to properly handle a sidearm. And the story goes that by the time he was a teenager, he was able to shoot the head off of a rattlesnake using either hand. Of course, by that point, his mother had remarried and they were living out west near present-day Bartlesville, Oklahoma. It's there in 1875 that he landed his very first adult job. According to Frank, quote, I began riding the range and looking after the stock for Osage Brown, a cattleman on Mission Creek in the Osage Nation. One day, while talking with some of the other riders, I learned that Shannon Campsey, one of the men who had killed my father, was down on the Canadian River southwest of Weber's Fall. So I began laying my plans to pay him a visit. Before I started on the trail for the killers, however, I wanted to see if I could learn more about shooting. End of quote. And yeah, that being the case, Frank headed over to Fort Gibson, hoping that maybe the soldiers could further refine his skills with a six-shooter. Turns out the exact opposite ended up happening. Frank competed with the troops in a series of shooting competitions, and he wound up beating all of them. Even the fort's commanding officer, Colonel John Coppinger, acknowledged Eaton's skill with the revolver, to the point that he not only gave him an award for marksmanship, but also the famous nickname of Pistol Pete. And it was at that point that young Frank set out to avenge his father's death. Keep in mind that he was still just around 15 years old. His first target was the aforementioned Shannon Campsey. Per Frank in his autobiography, quote, as I approached, I saw Shannon Campsey get up and go into the house and come out with a Winchester. He sat down in the chair with the Winchester across his lap and watched me. I knew he was fast and a dead shot, but I had been training for this since I was 8 years old, since that night when Shannon Campsey had emptied his gun to my father's body, as he lay dead at his feet, and then he kicked me and struck me with his whip. I rode up to the fence, which was about 30 feet from the house. Getting off my horse, I called out, hello, Shan, don't you know me? At the sound of his name, Shan jumped to his feet and raised his rifle to fire, but he was too slow. Like a rattler striking, my hand went to my hip. Before Shan's gun went off, there were 2 .45s through his breast. End of quote. Then, just a few days later, Frank located another one of the killers, a guy known as Doc Ferber, bringing cattle down in a nearby ravine. Once again, in Frank's own words, quote, as I got to the head of the ravine, a horseman rode up to meet me. There was something familiar in the look of him, and when he stopped and hailed me, I knew who he was. "Hello, boy," he said. "What are you doing here, and what do you want?" "I just want you, Doc Ferber," I said, "and I am sure glad I have found you." "Who the hell are you anyhow, and how do you know who I am?" "I am Frank Eaton, and I ought to know you, Doc Ferber, for you were one of the men who killed my father. Fill your hand, you son of a bitch." We both went for our guns, but Doc didn't have a Chinaman's chance. I had been working on that draw for years, just to use at this moment. Doc went off his horse headlong to the ground, his gun exploding as he landed stone dead, with 2.45 slugs through his breast. End of quote. And no, I did not add that part about him saying, "Fill your hands, you son of a bitch." I guess Charles Portis, the author of True Grit, must have also read Eaton's biography. As it turns out, this is not the only time Frank would utter that particular phrase. We'll get to that in just a moment, but next up on the chopping block was Doc's brother John. The only problem was, by the time Eaton caught up with him down in Southwest City, John had already been killed for cheating at poker. Frank did attend his funeral, though. Guess he wanted to make sure he was really dead. And it was there at the funeral that he made the acquaintance of a deputy marshal by the name of Chris Adams. Turns out Deputy Adams had also been hunting down the Ferber brothers, and he was so impressed with Frank that he hired him right there on the spot as a fellow deputy. So it were in 1877, at the tender age of just 17, that Frank Eaton became one of the youngest deputy US Marshals of all time. He'd soon go to work for Judge Parker over at Fort Smith, just like Bass Reeves, and chase down bad guys all over Indian Territory. Which, as fate would have it, also put him on the path of two more of his father's killers, Johns and Jim Campsey. He managed to track them all the way up to a small ranch in the Ozarks. He challenged them both to a duel, they accepted, and what followed was short and brutal. Needless to say, by the time the smoke cleared, Frank Eaton had gained another 2 notches. Now, the last and remaining killer, Wiley Campsey, was located tending bar not long thereafter, down in Albuquerque. Frank once again used his now signature line, "Fill your hand, you son of a bitch," but this time he was facing off not just against one opponent or 2 opponents, but 3. Turns out Wiley Campsey had 2 of his buddies back in his play. According to Frank, quote, "All 3 of them went for their guns. Wiley got his to the top of the bar, but went down with 2.45s through his heart. The guards were lightning on the draw. One of them went down without firing a shot, but the other one got me in the leg and again in the left arm, knocking one of my guns out of my hand before he went down." End of quote. Luckily for Frank, he received aid from none other than Pat Garrett. Supposedly Garrett was able to get him out of town somewhere where he could receive some proper doctoring. Now, obviously, the Old West wouldn't last forever. Thanks to men like Eaton, things soon became settled, even in a place as deadly as the Territory. And once the Oklahoma land rush opened up, Frank joined in with the other settlers and staked a claim southwest of what's now Perkins, Oklahoma. Now, this was a big turning point in Eaton's life. The vengeance trail was behind him, and for now at least, he was focused on building his future. And as such, he became ingrained in the local community, first serving as sheriff and then later on working as a farmer and the town blacksmith. That said, Pete never would put away his 6-shooters for good. He was the kind of guy who always treated his pistols sort of like the rest of us treat pocket knives, something they just do not leave home without. His preference was a Colt single-action army, and according to him, quote, "I would rather have a pocket full of rocks than an empty gun." I guess for a guy like Eaton, being armed was as natural as putting on boots. He also wasn't shy about showing off. One of his most famous tricks was tossing a coin in the air, drawing his pistol, and shooting it before it hit the ground. Whether he did this for practice or just entertainment, I honestly can't say, but I do know that it was stunts like this that helped gain him the reputation as being one of the fastest gunmen in all of the Old West. There are even some who claim that the expression "hotter than Pete's pistol" came from Eaton's uncanny abilities with a sidearm. But I guess life there in Perkins wasn't all about gunsmoke and bravado. Eaton married twice, he raised 9 children, and eventually lived to see dozens of grandchildren and even great-great-grandchildren. It was a quieter chapter compared to his early years, but in its own way just as remarkable. After all, Frank had managed to do something that few gunfighters ever achieved. He lived long enough to grow old, an accomplishment that gave him plenty of time to turn his experiences into stories. Stories that may not have been all that factual in nature. By the time the 20th century rolled around, Eaton had become sort of a local attraction. School children knew him as the man who could still spin a yarn about the wild old days, and visitors came from far and wide just to sit on his porch and listen to him talk. He wasn't just a relic of the frontier, he was living proof of it. And I guess it was only natural that people wanted to hear his stories and shake his hand. their own real-life connection to the Wild West. Skip ahead to 1923 at the Armistice Parade over in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and Eaton rode his horse proudly down Main Street, waving to the crowd with those ever-present six guns still on his hips. For the students attending Oklahoma A&M College, now known as Oklahoma State University, the sight struck a chord. At that time, their mascot was a tiger, a holdover from when the school called itself the Princeton of the Prairie. But be that as it may, many of the students felt like the tiger didn't necessarily reflect Oklahoma's true character or history. And when they saw Eaton ride in that parade, they saw something way better. A real-life frontier cowboy that seemed to perfectly embody the grit of the American West. And yeah, the idea took root. Eaton's nickname, Pistol Pete, became shorthand for the kind of rough and ready spirits that the students wanted for their mascot. Even the Oklahoma Times newspaper started phasing out terms like Aggie or Tigers, and instead started calling their teams the Cowboys. And by the late 1950s, the caricature of Pistol Pete had become the school's official mascot. Finally, in 1952, Eaton published his autobiography, Pistol Pete, Veteran of the Old West, a rollicking account of his time as a lawman and avenger, full of quick-draw showdowns and hairbreadth escapes, in which he claimed to have killed 11 men in fair fights, including the ones who had murdered his father. Now, Eaton himself would pass away there in Perkins on April 5th, 1958, at the ripe old age of 97. Dude was born prior to the Civil War. He witnessed bushwhackers kill his father, he helped track down all manner of wanted outlaws on horseback, and he somehow lived long enough to witness 2 world wars and the invention of the television. That will never cease to amaze me, or that will never not cease to amaze me. Anyway, you understand what I'm saying, right? It just goes to show that the Old West really wasn't all that long ago. If you're over the age of 68 right now, then you were alive at the very same time as a true blue Wild West gunfighter. Maybe. You see, while Pistol Pete's story is very fascinating, I think many of you already know where this is going, there's just not a lot of evidence to back it up. Not only does Eaton's name not appear on Judge Parker's roster of deputies, or literally anywhere else for that matter, but I was also unable to locate any proof of him killing the Ferber or Campsey brothers. I also couldn't even establish that they were even real people. And then, of course, many of his stories clash with known historical evidence. For instance, Frank said he was 8 years old when his father was killed in 1868. In all reality, his father died in 1871 when he was around 10 or 11. And that's if you believe his story about being born in 1860. I know the federal censuses aren't always perfect, but if you look at Frank's early records, all the way up to the 20th century, it shows that he was most likely born in the late 1860s as opposed to 1860, which would have made him a toddler at the time of his father's death. And I don't know about you, but I just can't see a 4-year-old practicing with a Colt's revolver, even in the Old West. And there are other discrepancies. I mean, he really did get a lot of dates wrong. That officer from Fort Gibson, Colonel Coppinger, the one that supposedly gave him the nickname Pistol Pete, he was a real person, but he wouldn't take command of the fort until 1886, a full decade after Eaton claimed to have met him. Another guy that Frank spoke quite a bit about was a Cherokee policeman named Sam Sixkiller, also a real-life person, but according to Frank, Sam was killed in 1879. But per literally all of the official records, Sam didn't bite the dust until 1886. And then, of course, there's his story about meeting Pat Garrett in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1881, when we do know for a fact that Pat had his hands full over 150 miles away at Fort Sumner. And finally, maybe the most damning of all, is the great Western historian Ramon Adams, who referred to Eaton's biography as, quote, a most preposterous tale and a distinct menace to Western history. Now, before you start sending me a very strongly worded email, I'm not done just yet, okay? There are a few points in Frank's favor. That guy I mentioned earlier, Mose Beeman, the one who urged him to seek vengeance, I did verify that he was a real person, and he did live in the very same area as the Eaton family. And even more intriguing, but I was unable to locate Frank on the 1880 census. You can find him in 1870, still living with his parents, and I was even able to track down a marriage record in Oklahoma from 1891. But so far as the paperwork is concerned, there's about 2 decades there where I'm not really sure what Frank was up to. Of course, that just so happens to be the same period when he claimed to have been a deputy and a cowboy and all that other stuff. Could he have been telling the truth and he just got some of the dates mixed up in his old age? Or was he just another fraud like Brushy Bill Roberts and J. Frank Dalton? I honestly don't have an answer. I will say this much though. Unlike the two imposters that I just mentioned, everything that Eaton claimed was mostly believable, for the most part, right? There are a few things that give me pause, like the fact that he always managed to double tap his opponents in the chest before they could even get off a shot. But he never really did make any claims that I would consider as being too outrageous. Gun to my head, if I had to make a decision right now, just going off what little information I have at my disposal, I'm going to say that Frank Eaton probably never wore a badge, and he probably did not avenge his father's murder, if his father was even murdered in the first place. Look, I do think an argument could be made that he maybe possibly served in law enforcement in some capacity. Maybe he participated in a few cattle drives in his early years. But as things currently stand, there is zero proof or corroboration other than his own stories. And if you strip away all the exaggerations, there's still a core of lived experience, right? Eaton really did grow up in violent times. He really did become known for his marksmanship, at least later on in Oklahoma, and he really did carry his pistols well into his old age. Whether every shootout happened exactly as he said probably didn't matter all that much to the people who flocked to hear his stories. They weren't coming for affidavits and court documents. They were just there to hear what they thought was a living relic of the frontier, tell stories in the way that only an old cowboy is capable of doing. So yeah, Frank Eaton may not have been the most reliable of sources, but he was a master storyteller. And sometimes when it comes to the Old West, the legend can quickly overtake the truth. And more often than not, before you know it, the legend is all that remains. What Frank inspired there in Oklahoma would end up spreading farther than anyone could have possibly imagined. Nowadays, the Pistol Pete mascot doesn't just ride for Oklahoma State University. Variations of the character have also been adopted by the University of Wyoming and New Mexico State University. Not only that, but the National Cowboy Museum honored Frank with the Director's Award in 1997. This was followed by his induction into the Hall of Great Westerners in 2022, and then just a few months ago, Oklahoma State University added Frank to its own Hall of Fame. Proof that more than 6 decades after his death, Eaton's image still looms just as large as ever. But what do you think? Was he a fraud, a gifted storyteller, or was he the real deal? Did Frank really wear a badge to track down his father's killers, or was he just an old man telling tall tales? Hit me up in the comments and let me know. I am genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on Pistol Pete. Until next time, adios.